Tragically, 1,159 men, survivors of the death railway and all of its hardships, either drowned or died of exposure after days floating in the sea. It was a colossal loss of life, and as the Sealion II dived to avoid depth charges, the young sailors who celebrated their kill had no idea of the catastrophe unfolding above them. While the Sealion II dived to safety, the Growler and the Pampanito set off after the convoy. When Commander Oakley caught up with it, the survivors in the water found themselves in the middle of a fierce naval battle. The Growler fired its torpedoes at the Japanese frigate Hirado and scored a direct hit. Some men in the water cheered, while others saw all chance of rescue disappear. The shockwaves from the Hirado explosion killed some prisoners. Others died when the Japanese retaliated with depth charges or were killed by the propellers. The Growler got away unscathed. It was Oakley's last major triumph. 2 months later, he and his crew were killed when the Growler succumbed to Japanese depth charging. Darkness had once again fallen, and the Kachidoki Maru steamed north towards Taiwan, making a dash for protective air cover. But by 11 o'clock that night, the Pampanito caught up with us, and 31-year-old skipper Paul Summers was planning a very special celebration of his birthday, which had taken place just a few days before on the day we sailed from Singapore. Any hopes we had that we had outrun the wolf pack or that the attack was over were about to be dashed. Summers prepared to mount a surface attack on the Kachidoki Maru, but had to abandon it because of technical difficulties. His crew worked feverishly to fix the problem, and Summers resumed the attack. We were the biggest vessel among the group of small ships and made a juicy target. As the Kachidoki Maru steamed into the crosshairs of Pampanito's periscope, Summers gave the fateful order to fire. 4 minutes later, we suddenly felt a tremendous blast, and an explosion tore through the hold. The whole structure shuddered, and water flooded in from above. I knew then, as the water crashed on top of me, that my worst fears had been realized. We had been hit, and I knew that the torpedo had struck very close to us. It was in fact the first of 2 torpedoes that would send the hellship to the bottom within 15 minutes. The ship tilted. We were going down. Up above, the Japanese began shooting their wounded men in the sick bay in mercy killings. Down below, men shouted and panicked and scrambled madly for the single ladder up onto the deck. The noise was horrendous, but the pressure of the water must have pushed the hatches wide open. Either that, or someone on deck, whether one of the stowaways or one of the POWs up there at the time we were hit, gave us a chance. Water rushed into the hold straight away with incredible pressure. It pushed me up as the ship continued to tip over. The hatches became parallel with the sea now, and by some miracle the water washed me out of the hatch, and I floundered into a stream or strong current that rushed me out into the sea. It all seemed to happen at once. I popped out of the ship like a cork out of a champagne bottle. After the extreme heat of the hold, the water felt very cold. The sea was just a mass of thick oil, as a total of 12 ships in our convoy were sunk that night. I knew I had to get as far away from the ship as possible as soon as I could, to avoid being dragged under with it, but it was like swimming through treacle. Those of us who could swim were the only ones who had a chance. I knew from my Boy Scout training that I had to swim away to avoid getting pulled down by the suction. I swam for my life as hard as I could, away from the waves created by the pull of the ship going down. I put my head down and powered with desperate overarm strokes, dodging debris as I went, all the time gulping down oil. It was like drinking fire and burned all the way down, doing irreparable damage to my vocal cords. When I was 50 yards away, I felt safe for the moment. I turned to look at the ship. Treading water, I saw it tilt, and then, in just a few seconds, the stern silently and gracefully slipped under the waves. The sea was now aflame as the oil burned, and a torpedoed oil tanker was well ablaze. Like a scene from Dante's Inferno, smoke filled the night sky, and shouts and screams came from all directions. As the flames got closer, I feared that I might be burned alive. Luckily, they spluttered out before reaching me, and then I was very sick, bringing up a horrible mixture of crude oil and salt water. Even after the sinking, the killing went on for those of us who survived and got onto rafts. Anyone starting to panic was thrown off into the sea. When they scrambled to get back on, they were kicked away. Men pushed under and held under by Japanese survivors. Fighting broke out as the animal instinct to survive asserted itself, making some survivors try to capture more seaworthy vessels and shove others off to their deaths. Many gave up, already so weak, dangerously dehydrated and ill. Frequently they had been injured too in the sinking. Many gulped salt water and quickly went stark raving mad, drowning themselves to end the torment. Horrible as it may sound, as men became mad, they had to be shoved off the rafts or boats, or the remainder might have perished. There was a lot of shouting and screaming, cries of "Get off, you fool!" or "I'll kill you!" made me close my eyes in distress. Most of the shouts were in English. There were not many Japanese, the majority of whom had gotten off early in lifeboats. Drowning and dying men called for their wives, their children, or mothers. Men said things like, "Daddy will be home soon," and then disappeared beneath the waves. It was harrowing to hear. By that stage, most of us were treading a very fine line between sanity and madness. It didn't take much to put people over the top. I couldn't see where it was coming from, but a group of men started singing. First, to keep their spirits up, they sang Rule Britannia. After the Selarang incident, we had been banned from singing this stirring anthem with its line about Britons never, ever being slaves. But this was a strange freedom, and as the situation worsened, the song changed, and the poignant words of the great hymn Abide With Me drifted across the South China Sea. It was very moving, and I still cannot bear to hear that hymn in church. I felt horrendous and wondered if I would last the night. How little could a human being survive on? I was about to find out. In the water with bedlam all around, a great urge to be on my own engulfed me. It felt like the safest tactic. 244 of my comrades on the Kachidoki Maru died that night. It was tragic beyond belief that, having survived the death railway, they became prisoners of the deep. Suddenly the thought of sharks came into my mind. I knew that I must have suffered some cuts on the way out, and that sharks were attracted to the scent of blood. I had to get out of the water as soon as I could. My prayers were answered when a single-man raft came floating past. Exhausted and covered in thick bunker oil, I hoisted myself into it. It was oval-shaped, like a big dog's basket, made of a cork-like substance, and just big enough for me to sit in with my legs out in front. It had no provisions in it. With so many dead bodies floating in the water, the sharks must have had a field day. From the sea, I picked up shreds of string and rope, as well as bits of wood that I thought might be useful later. I also managed to find a few scraps of canvas to shield me from the sun if I lasted that long. I looked for anything in the water that might do for a paddle, but it was pointless anyway. I didn't know in which direction to paddle. It was amazing how quickly I drifted away from the rest of the shipwrecked men. I could soon see outlines of people in the water in the distance, all of them covered in oil. I had no way to know who they were, whether Japanese or POWs. It was easy to mistake a Japanese for one of my own. I made up my mind that if it came down to me or a Japanese, he would be going to meet his ancestors. The position I had drifted to must have been in the opposite direction from the bulk of the flotilla. A strong current took me even further away. The noise from everyone else in the sea started to fade anyway. Soon I was alone and bitterly cold in the night air. I tried to use the rope I had picked out of the water to lash the raft together more sturdily, but it was very difficult in the dark and with my lack of energy. Yet I busied myself, knowing that I had to stay awake to stay alive. When light came in the morning, I was utterly alone. There was not a thing in sight. Just the vastness of the blue sea, the infinite blue sky, and the scorching yellow sun. Whether it was because of the heat, thirst, or oil, my tongue had begun to swell. My eyes stung from the oil. When the sun had been up a couple of hours, I had still not seen or heard a thing. I started to think of home, of my family and friends, and of happy times in Scotland. Cast away and dreaming of home, I was shocked to suddenly hear a shout from behind me. "You will be picked up soon," a voice called out. My spirits soared at the thought of a companion to share the ordeal, but my joy was short-lived. I turned around full of expectation only to be confronted by a Japanese officer in a one-man raft similar to mine. Immediately I thought, right, here we go. I couldn't see if he still had his sword or not, but I prepared myself for a fight. There was no way to fight from the raft. I knew it had to be in the water. I knew that my swimming ability would give me the edge. I had my life-saving badge, and I could control a frantic person in the water. He was also fully dressed in a tunic, trousers, and boots, so I was confident of beating him. It was incredible that even in the extreme circumstances we were in, the need to defend yourself from another human being was uppermost in my mind. He was using a proper paddle to come towards me. I steeled myself, but he stopped 5 yards or so away and shouted, "Here!" as he threw me a tin. Despite my oily hands, I managed to catch it. The Japanese officer then paddled off without saying anything more, and it was the last I saw of him. The top on the tin was sealed and waterproof. I clawed at it frantically, eager to know what was inside. It seemed to take forever. When I finally managed to prise the top off, my heart sank. The tin contained chocolates, something we could have only dreamed of in the last 2 years, but a death sentence for me now, dehydrated and adrift in the tropical ocean. I would have loved to have devoured those chocolates, but I knew that afterwards they would have sent me mad with thirst. Eating them may have even killed me because I had eaten nothing like that for such a long time. Immediately I threw the tin and its lid in the water. I watched it sink and realized I probably should have discarded the chocolates, but kept the tin to catch any rainwater. It was a cruel moment. I was alone again, and so tired, completely unable to do anything. All I could do was lie there and use my brain and imagination to keep me awake. One of the things I did was to go back in my mind to the plumber's merchant in Aberdeen I worked at before the war. I did a mental stocktake through the bins and warehouse, memorizing all of the stock. Going through the drawers of pipes, fittings, couplings, screws, nuts and washers took a long time, and I enjoyed it. I even made up imaginary orders for customers in the big houses. It was so hot out on the open sea with the unrelenting glare bouncing off the water. My burning skin was dissolving into saltwater immersion sores, made even more painful when crude oil got into the fissures. It felt like being cooked alive. When one part of my skin could take no more of the blowtorch heat, I would move my little pieces of canvas around, feebly trying to gain some protection. I began to think of the cold and bitter winters back in Aberdeen, almost willing myself cool. I recalled childhood days of making slides and organising snowball fights, and smiled as I thought of our sledging expeditions to Auchignel Bray, where we would toboggan from early morning until late at night, returning home with ears and fingers frozen numb. Images began flooding back. I could see the fantastic sight of the mighty carts that belonged to Wardy and Company picking up goods from the warehouse to take them down to the railway goods station. It was amazing to see the giant Clydesdales struggling in pairs up frosty braes, hauling huge loads with their masters, whipping them on and shouting out obscenities. The carters were a Gallus's lot, really rough and ready. I laughed to myself as I thought of the rag and bone man too. At the sound of his bugle, we kids would swarm behind his cart like a plague of locusts, hoping to be given a balloon or to pick up the steaming horse dung to take triumphantly back home for Mum to put on the garden. There were some real fights over that dung. When the sun went down again, it was bitingly cold. A full moon on that cloudless second night made it feel even colder for some reason. I had the bits and pieces of canvas draped over me, but I was still so cold. Terrified of rolling off the raft, I had to stay awake. I was at my lowest ebb. The light from the moon struck the water and reflected bright in my eyes. I started to see things that weren't there. Imaginary bits of wreckage or a boat would suddenly come into view. I began to lose my senses, saying to myself, "Come on, let yourself go to sleep." It was always an inner battle. Half of me wanted to give up. The other half refused. And so it went on. Alone, with no sight of land, birds, dolphins, or life of any kind, I sang songs to keep my mind occupied and awake. No words would come out of my parched throat, but I sang them in my head. I went through all the pre-1940 dance songs I knew and always returned to my favourite, It's a Sin to Tell a Lie. It was a hit for Fats Waller, and I sang it over and over and over in my head. Be sure it's true when you say I love you. It's a sin to tell a lie. Millions of hearts have been broken, just because these words were spoken. I love you, yes I do, I love you. If you break my heart, I'll die, so be sure it's true when you say I love you. It's a sin to tell a lie. Unknown to me, over 650 survivors of the Kachidoki Maru had already been picked up by the Japanese and the Pampanito, which had returned to the scene of the original attack to make a horrible discovery. As the submarine surfaced amid the debris and wreckage of the Rakuyo Maru, the crew saw survivors who had been in the water for 3 days and were horrified when weak voices started shouting. At first, the young Americans could not understand the British and Australian accents until one of the sailors made out the words, "Pick us up, please." Then the awful reality dawned. These oil-covered survivors were not Japanese, but English, Scottish, and Australian. The Wolf Pack had sunk 2 hell ships packed with prisoners of war. 1,403 Allied servicemen had died as a result of the failure of the Japanese to observe the Geneva Convention and apply red crosses to our hell ships. Pampanito promptly radioed for assistance, and the Celian II and 2 other American submarines returned to the scene. With survivors too weak to clamber aboard the subs, American sailors dived into the sea to pull men out, rescuing a total of 159 men. A handful died on board, and the Americans were horrified at the condition of the survivors, and to hear about the death railway and the privations we had endured. Incredibly, the evidence gleaned from these survivors allowed the Allies to discover for the first time the true extent of the horrors on the death railway, and simultaneous announcements were subsequently made to stunned Houses of Parliament in both London and Canberra. The men picked up by the subs were the lucky ones. Joe Bates, communications officer on the Celian II, later told how his captain angered the crew by ordering the submarine to dive after rescuing just 50 survivors, leaving behind dozens of others frantically calling out, "Over here! Over here!" It was a heartbreaking decision, but Lieutenant Commander Eli Reich feared for the safety of his vessel. The cries of the men left behind haunted Joe Bates and his shipmates for decades. I was still drifting alone. By the time the sun came up on the 5th day, I could no longer see. My eyes had been seared by the dazzling sun and sparkling sea. I had no eyebrows or hair on my head. I think the sheer shock of what was happening to me had caused my hair to fall out. I kept moving around in my tiny raft the best I could and prayed for rain. I sang to myself and vainly tried to croak out loud, urging myself, "Hang on in there until you can't hang on any longer." Badly burned by the sun, my tongue swollen, gripped by a maddening thirst, effectively blind and completely hairless, I fell into a trance-like state. I was on the very edge of death. At some point on that 5th day, there came a lot of shouting around me. I was lifted into a small boat and then onto a Japanese whaling ship. I must have been left on deck, but from there on I have no real recollection. I don't know what the Japanese on board that ship did for me. As far as I was concerned, they just left me alone, but they must have at least given me some water. I was as close to death as I had ever been. The next thing I knew, I was being dropped off at a port, which I later learned was on Hainan Island. Congregated, there were other shipwrecked POW survivors. As a punishment, we were paraded through the village stark naked. One man shouted out, "If we work like horses, we may as well look like them." I was so burned and emaciated and ill that I staggered through the streets like a drunk. Some of the locals turned their backs on this terrible procession, but others jeered and spat at us. I was past caring. There must have been at least 100 of us, and then came an incredible and inspiring episode. As we stumbled along in the pouring rain, someone started singing. It was "Singin' in the Rain." And slowly we all took up the song and joined in, singing a very rude version of the hit, complete with altered lyrics crudely deriding our Japanese captors. Even in this terrible condition, and after all we had been through, my comrades, ravaged by exposure, naked and in slavery, were defiant, their spirits unbroken. The effects of the exposure I suffered during my ordeal in the South China Sea had led to a complete collapse in my health. At the camp on Hainan, I hovered at death's door, drifting in and out of awareness, but mostly out of it. Eventually, on the 18th of September, I was stretchered onto another hell ship and lowered into the hold. As our ship made a dash for the Japanese mainland, dodging prowling American submarines, I lay blissfully unaware of the grim conditions in the bowels of the vessel. It was another terrible journey, and must have been full of angst for the conscious survivors. We were on board for 11 days with no drugs or medical assistance whatsoever for 120 ill men in our contingent. Terrified of further attacks, the Japanese had commandeered all of the lifebelts, and despite the protests of Captain Wilkie, they had only 2 or 3 each, with none available for prisoners. Our convoy was attacked again, and a destroyer was sunk. We were lucky to escape being sunk for a second time, and it was nothing short of miraculous that only 5 men died in the holds during the voyage. Unknown to me, I had a guardian angel. Dr. Matheson was tending to me. I came to my senses as we arrived in Japan, and found myself being driven into the middle of a barren, almost desert-like landscape, to a bleak prison camp surrounded by a 10-foot-high wooden fence with barbed wire on top. Along with others, I was slung into a timber hut, where we slept on the floor Japanese style. Exhausted, I did not wake the entire night. The next morning, I struggled to make it out of the hut for roll call. We were issued Japanese green, all-in-one boiler suits with zip-up fronts, and rubber boots like those worn by the Nippon soldiers. I had to roll the sleeves up on my overalls, which struck me as strange since the Japanese didn't have long arms. A Japanese officer told us that we were in a place called Omuta, and that our camp was designated Fukuoka Camp 25. It was a few miles from a seaport that owed much of its modern prosperity to the efforts of an Aberdeen merchant called Thomas Glover. He had opened Japan's first coal mines and developed the country's first dry dock in the city. Its only other claim to fame was as the setting of Puccini's Madame Butterfly. That seaport was called Nagasaki. We were put to work immediately, this time labouring in a nearby open-cast coal mine. I was still in a terrible state. I barely knew my own name and could hardly stand. I dreaded hard labour. We marched for half an hour along a dirt track to the coal mine, which was quite small, much smaller than the ones I knew of on the east coast of Scotland. We saw very few locals, and when we did, they never gave us a second look. Vegetable plants grew on the roadside verge. The Japanese mainland was literally starving, and food was being grown on every available scrap of land. There was, of course, no improvement to our rations. We filled coal carts with our bare hands and sometimes shovels, and then, in groups of 4, had to push the laden carts along a small railway, 50 yards or so up a slight incline, to a point where we would tip them over and the coal would fall onto a large mound that trucks would take away. It was quite an effort to get the carts moving, even with 4 of us hard at it. But I doubt I was much use to anyone. I was completely worn out. It was nothing short of miraculous that I was still alive, and I was a husk of a man, certainly unfit to work. I could do no more. There were several of these mines scattered around Omuta, one of which was owned by a family called ASO. For decades after the war, the Japanese government denied that Allied prisoners had been used as slaves in any of these mines and factories, and it was only recently when researchers proved that the family of Taro Aso, the former Prime Minister of Japan, had personally profited from the labour of 197 Australian, 101 British, and 2 Dutch prisoners that we received any kind of grudging recognition. In January 2009, Mr. ASO finally acknowledged for the first time that about 300 Allied POWs had indeed been forced to work at the ASO Mining Company's Yoshikuma coal mine in Fukuoka. Mr. ASO would later become president of the company, but until 2009 he maintained that the claims about POW labour could not be substantiated, and because he was only 4 or 5 years old at the time, he had no personal knowledge of it. After a couple of days at the coal mine, I went to the hospital hut to sign off sick. In the long room were half a dozen beds filled with acute dysentery and malaria sufferers. A doctor saw me enter and walked down the centre aisle. As he approached, I thought I recognized his strut and ruddy complexion. When he got closer, I could not believe my eyes. "Dr. Matheson, I presume?" He grinned and shook my hand in true reserved Scots fashion, but I was unsure that he had recognized me, so I nudged his memory. "Can you?" "Good to see you, Alistair," he said, and genuinely seemed to mean it too. I was sure glad to see him anyway. He had already saved my life more than once. Our quick catch-up chat did not dwell on the railway or the hell ships. We just wanted to forget that, lest it sap what little energy and will we had left. He did not even mention at this stage how he and his orderlies had nursed me on the second leg of our voyage while I was delirious. He signed me off work at the coal mine and reassigned me to camp duties once I had rested up. A few days later, I reported to the orderly officer, a lieutenant who gave me all manner of duties to carry out that day. I was the general dog's body of the camp and relished the role. I started off helping in the cookhouse before emptying the contents of the Japanese latrines on their rows of tomato plants. I very rarely saw any Japanese in the camp, even during the day, and that suited me fine. They lived off-site and came in only when there was something serious going on. Usually we just had Korean guards, and even they didn't bother going to the mines with the men, so most of the time everyone got on with things. It was a pleasant change in circumstances. I spent my afternoons tidying the yard with the besom-style brushes the Japanese favoured, and would be finished by the time the work party returned. From then on, I spent most of my spare time and evenings at the hospital hut. Dr. Matheson and I spoke for hours on all topics. It turned out that he also loved the outdoors, especially hill walking, and had played rugby at high school. He was well educated and very capable. It was good to have some intelligent conversation. We were on the same wavelength and, as fellow Scots, often talked of home. Much of the chatter among the men could be pretty banal and boring, but Dr. Matheson took me under his wing and imparted a lot of his medical knowledge and wisdom. He played a big part in bringing me out of the protective shell that I had retreated into during my time on the railway and the slavery of Singapore docks. I began regaining my personality. Eventually, the good doctor convinced our orderly officers as well as the Japanese to allow me to help out at the hospital as an orderly. My elevation had the blessing of Sergeant Ferguson, who was in charge of the hospital alongside Matheson. He was very laid-back and quiet, but brilliant at his job. I had the task of ensuring that patients were as comfortable and disease-free as possible. By turning and bathing them and conducting basic massages, I made sure that they did not get bed sores. Generally, I tried to keep their spirits up. I also fetched their meals, made at the cookhouse, and carried them back on trays. Dr. Matheson spent most of the time thinking up new ways of helping the sick. He was every bit a doctor, there was no mistaking him. Most of our patients could prove rather difficult. They often got angry and even physical, hitting out for no real reason. But Matheson was extremely caring and never once got annoyed himself. He had a presence that even the most difficult patients seemed to accept. He became an inspirational figure to me. We had no real equipment or drugs, so we had to be resourceful. Then Dr. Matheson had the brainwave of bolstering the sick by injecting them with distilled water just under the skin. A placebo, it seemed to really rejuvenate the men, whether it was all in the mind or not. Alas, we could still do nothing for their pain. We did not even have aspirin. All we could do was offer some consoling words. The dedicated and compassionate care provided by Dr. Matheson and Sergeant Ferguson ensured that only 4 men died during our time in Japan. They all died in October 1944, and 3 of these deaths were due partly to the effects of exposure after having been torpedoed on the hell ships. One of those who died was a young Gordon Highlander, Private Henry Elder. He came from the tiny fishing village of Gordon, a few miles south of Aberdeen. I did not like to dwell on the tragedy of a young lad from this tranquil village, famed for its lobsters, who died alone so far from home after having survived so much. Another victim, a young Cockney called Tommy Taylor, died because we had no drugs to give him. He was survived by a twin brother in the camp. It was just too much to hope that both boys could survive the death railway and the hell ships. We cremated the 4 men and hid their ashes in a Buddhist temple for safekeeping. Dr. Mathieson was a good teacher. He patiently explained how beriberi was the result of vitamin deficiencies and how to diagnose other tropical diseases. Perhaps the most important piece of advice I received from him was delivered almost as an afterthought, as if I should know it already. He warned me that when I got out of camp, I would have to be careful about what I ate. "You'll never be able to eat what you used to," he said. "Your stomach has shrunk so much that you'll have to be very careful. Anything too substantial, eaten too quickly, could kill you." It would prove life-saving advice. The food at the camp had already caused a near-fatal encounter when the Japanese gave the cookhouse some contaminated seafood. It caused havoc. While deliciously salty and one of the finest culinary moments of my life, the pleasure was short-lived. All of those who ate the food, including myself, became seriously ill with food poisoning. It struck within hours. We suffered debilitating vomiting and diarrhea, both ends going at once. The mess and stench were out of this world. Men lay doubled over, screaming out in agony. Dr. Mathieson, who was also a victim, proved wonderful on that occasion, working day and night to save dozens of lives. Within 24 hours, the nightmare was over, and incredibly, nobody had succumbed. There were still instances of Japanese tyranny. Whether or not they gave us the seafood knowing that it was contaminated, I could not be sure. But when someone stole some sugar from a storeroom, the Japanese felt it was time to stamp their authority back on us. The whole camp, including us medical orderlies, was made to kneel erect on the parade square all night. With temperatures dropping below 0, it was a long stretch. If you faltered from your position, the Japanese hosed water onto your legs, which in the sharp frost froze. The pain was something else. The punishment didn't freeze out the thief, and it ended at 5 a.m. when the work party was gathered to go back to the mine. During this time, I acquired so much patience, understanding, and caring that I began to feel better about myself, even though I was skin and bone. My eyebrows started to sprout, as did some fuzzy clumps of hair. I had thoughts of training as a doctor if I ever got back to Scotland. I thought I was capable enough and had decided that I really wanted to help others. One night in my hut, I made a silent vow to spend the rest of my life bettering the lot of others. Being in Japan, on the mainland, I felt slightly more optimistic, closer to civilization, away from the arena of war. On the railway you felt forgotten, left to die and never to be heard of again. The jungle eroded any thoughts of rescue or going home. While Chunkai was comfortable, the fear of returning to the railway remained ever present. But in Japan and cooler climes, we always thought someone could come and save us. The only danger was that the saviours would arrive too late, after the Japanese had killed us all. After 6 months at the camp, I could sense that the Allies were winning the war in the Pacific. You could tell by the demeanour of the guards that it wasn't going well for them. They seemed to be extra glad to get out of the camp and return to their families when working parties returned. I saw some actually running through the gates. We were gaining the upper hand, and both sides in the camp knew it. In one incident during the summer of 1945, Captain Wilkie threatened a bullying Japanese sergeant that he would have him shot after the war, something that would have been unthinkable on the railway. He also rejected repeated Japanese attempts to persuade us to make statements blaming the Americans for sinking us, which they could use for propaganda purposes. Increasingly, they left us alone. As the noose tightened around Japan, the guards reduced our meagre rations even further. Men developed boils and abscesses, and instances of prisoners fainting at work increased. But subsisting on a diet of rice and occasionally beans, we started to receive the remnants of Red Cross parcels looted by our captors. We tasted raisins and cheese for the first time in years. It was the first evidence I had seen of the Red Cross during my entire captivity. At Christmas 1944, the Japanese had allowed us to celebrate with a day off. I had thought of home, and it had suddenly struck me that it was 6 long years since I had celebrated Christmas there, back in 1938. By the summer of 1945, bombing raids were becoming more frequent too. We saw scores of B-29 superfortresses flying over us to pace Japanese cities and towns, including those close to us. The 9th of August, 1945, began like any other boring day in captivity. At dawn we turned out for Tenko, and the work parties marched out to the factory where our men now slaved. They were quite glad to be under guard. Since the incendiary bombings of Omuta and Nagasaki, Japanese civilians had taken to stoning POWs, and there had been several vicious incidents with civilians in the factory. I began my daily chores around the camp prior to reporting to the hospital for orderly duties. On an airbase thousands of miles away in the Mariana Islands, a young U.S. Air Force officer, Captain Charles Sweeney, aged just 25 like myself, was beginning a day that would be anything but normal. He and his youthful crew had already undergone a briefing and enjoyed the traditional early morning breakfast before any bombing mission. The chaplain's prayer had been a little bit more emotional than usual, and the escort for Boxcar, his B-29 bomber, carried pressmen and photographers. 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, fascist hardliners in the Japanese government still wanted to fight on. Stalin was already ripping apart the Japanese army in Manchuria, and the outcome of the war seemed obvious. But the diehards wanted to fight on in the Japanese home islands, and among their plans they intended to massacre all Allied prisoners of war. Little Boy had wiped out Hiroshima and 140,000 of its people, but had failed to persuade Japan's rulers of the hopelessness of their cause. Now U.S. President Harry Truman decided that another message must be sent. Sweeney's bomb hold contained just one huge bomb: Fat Man. Millions of man-hours had gone into designing this implosion-type plutonium bomb. Over 10 feet long and 5 feet in diameter, it weighed in at 10,200 pounds and was designed to be burst 1,800 feet above its target. But the initial target for Sweeney and his 24-year-old co-pilot, First Lieutenant Charles Albury, was not Nagasaki but Kokura, the port city where we had landed in the hellship from Hainan. The young pilots made 3 passes on Kokura, but found it clouded over and were unable to comply with orders to drop the bomb visually if possible. Running low on fuel and fearing they might have to ditch Fat Man in the sea, Sweeney and Albury turned their attention towards nearby Nagasaki. It was covered with cloud, too. But suddenly, from 30,000 feet up, Boxcar's 27-year-old veteran bomb aimer Kermit Behan caught a glimpse of the Nagasaki Stadium and pressed the button that released the bomb. It was around midday, and I had finally plucked up the courage to undertake my most hateful task. Emptying the latrine cans onto the Japanese officers' tomato plants always made my stomach turn, but I did have to marvel at the spectacular effect it produced in the plants, which boasted tomatoes the size of apples. Earlier in the morning I had heard the drone of an aeroplane flying overhead. I looked up and saw it was flying quite low, in fact low enough to see its American military markings. I looked up open-mouthed as it flew directly over us. Since March 1945, we had seen growing numbers of American bombers flying above us to pound Japanese targets. Yet I was amazed this plane was flying so low and unchallenged. It made me think for an instant that the war might be over, but as it disappeared, my optimism went with it. We were unaware that Japan had been plunged into chaos at the top with the dropping 3 days earlier of Little Boy. I was taking as much care as possible to avoid being splashed with the revolting contents of the cans as I moved up and down the drills of tomato plants behind the huts. The job always made me gag, but was lighter work than the mines and furnaces. Halfway up a drill there came a tremendous clap of thunder from the direction of Nagasaki. I didn't think too much of it, and had just finished watering the plants when a sudden gust of very hot air like a giant hairdryer blasted into me. It knocked my shrunken frame sideways, and I had to use my bamboo ladle to prevent myself from falling over completely. I wondered where the freak wind had come from. I had never experienced anything like it. It came and went so quickly. But I didn't give it too much thought. In fact, when I went into the hospital hut, I didn't even mention the hot air to Dr. Matheson. Instead, we discussed the low-flying plane. Like me, he couldn't understand why it had not been challenged as all previous raiders had. Then the men came back from the factory and began to talk of a massive raid on Nagasaki and a huge direct hit on the armory at the naval base. Massive clouds of smoke had been seen, but we had spotted no planes from the camp. Some men claimed to have seen dozens, even hundreds of planes, others none. As usual, the camp generated abundant rumours and great speculation. We knew that something big had happened down in Nagasaki. One Gordon proffered hopefully, "They're bombing the hell out of the place. It's the final push. We'll be out of here in a week." But the low-flying lone plane attracted equally frenzied speculation. One of the lads suggested, "It's high-ranking American officials, Winston Churchill himself maybe, coming to talk the nip fools into surrender." I remained less optimistic. There had been so many setbacks that I refused to allow myself to contemplate something as dramatic as the end. On the hospital rounds, Dr. Mathieson was puzzled too. "Why was there no opposition to those American planes?" he queried as I shadowed him. "Never saw a Japanese plane. Neither did anyone else," I said, not knowing what to think. Starved of news in the camp, our imaginations were nothing if not fevered. But none of us could have dreamed up what had happened at Nagasaki. The strange gust that had knocked me over was the hot breath of Fat Man, a nuclear weapon with even more destructive power than its cousin Little Boy. Unknown to us, we had entered the atomic age. Temperatures at ground zero in Nagasaki had flashed to between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees centigrade. The entire city had been flattened and 39,000 people had been vaporized instantly by this single bomb. The world had changed forever. Only the presence of large tracts of water within the city had prevented a fierce firestorm from developing and causing even greater loss of life. The undulating landscape had saved us from the worst of the blast, but one of the camps nearby had been hit and 6 prisoners were killed. As we finished the rounds, Dr. Mathieson's brow furrowed. "If this is the end, hypothetically speaking, of course, what will the Japanese do with us?" Having seen their appetite for wanton cruelty and death, and knowing their stance on the dishonour of surrender, it was a gut-churning question. Indeed, we later learned that the Japanese emperor had issued strict instructions to murder any POWs on the mainland, should it ever be invaded. Looking back, I'm glad not to have known. I told Matheson that if the Japanese stormed our camp with the intention of massacring us all, we should fight to the death. Hopeless as our position was, with no weapons or means of fighting back, I wanted to make sure I took a few of the buggers with me. "That's the spirit," he replied, much too unconvincingly. For several days it was business as usual. Then, on the 15th of August, the men came back from the factory and said that its manager had spoken to a mass meeting of the workforce and broke down crying during his speech. The 15th of August, we were told, would be a big day of mourning for Japan. By now we felt sure that the war was over. Finally, on the 21st of August, we were paraded and the Japanese commander read out the declaration of the cessation of hostilities that had been called 6 days earlier. Gradually the British took over the running of the camp, but in the absence of the Japanese, our food rations were diminishing rapidly. Leaflets promising imminent food drops came from above, but the men were becoming hungry and restless. To appease them and their growling guts, the officers allowed the slaughter of some pigs and chickens, which had been kept by the Japanese officers. The animals were killed unceremoniously in the parade square, their blood darkening the dirt. Our portions were minuscule, but the chicken was delicious and the pork was simply divine. The latter was also especially good for the patients, said Dr. Matheson, because of the high salt content. At least that was the argument he put forward on behalf of the sick patients for extra rations. On the 25th of August, we received our first food drops. While most Red Cross supply crates and canisters came parachuting lightly to the ground, others thundered into the earth, huts, dining halls, latrines, and trees like bombs. One man was slightly injured by flying splinters of wood when a canister landed on a building. Another thought he was covered in blood, but it turned out to be tomato puree. Others, Japanese natives, were reportedly killed by the falling canisters. The parcels contained messages ordering us to remain inside the camp and wait to be liberated. Army discipline stood firm. The life-saving canisters were filled with relief foodstuffs, sugar, milk, rice, as well as cigarettes and matches. Dr. Matheson ensured that the sick got first choice of proper food and insisted that the cookhouse did not produce any rich meals, which would have devastated our stomachs. Penicillin and aspirin also came in the drops, along with bandages, dressings, ointment, soap, sheets, towels, and pillowcases. Finally, our makeshift hospital was almost looking like the real thing. As the weeks wore on, our wait for rescue became incredibly frustrating. I never even contemplated leaving the camp until, one day early in September, a frantic Japanese man came running to us. Directed to the hospital hut, he found Dr. Matheson and me. In stilted English, he managed to convey that his daughter was sick. "Very small," he managed, indicating with a grubby, weathered hand at his waist to show us her size. "You help," he said. "But no drugs," replied Matheson. "You come! You come!" he pleaded. He grabbed my hand and pulled me out of the hut. Matheson grabbed some of his rudimentary medical implements and came with us. We trotted behind the urging father, his wooden sandals clacking along the dirt track. After about 10 minutes, we arrived at a modest, low-slung Japanese house. We removed our rubber boots and entered. It was the most bizarre house I had ever been in, with everything on the floor and a distinct lack of seating. Dark and cool inside, a woman in black silk trousers and a gaily coloured blouse, whom I took for the man's wife, waved at us and pointed to a murky corner. A young girl of about 9 or 10 lay curled up on the floor, shivering and barely able to offer a wave. Dr. Matheson saw to her and quickly realised she was running a dangerous temperature. She had a smattering of English, and the Paisley doctor managed to ascertain she had stomach pains. We sponged her down, trying to relieve her fever, and then asked for some boiling water. I tried to explain that she should just take small sips. We got her temperature down, but nothing much else could be done. Dr. Matheson said, 2 days, and held up 2 fingers to indicate she would be okay in 48 hours. He tried to explain the importance of light foods, and was doing chicken impressions, which made all of us laugh. While we had been attending to the girl, the woman, who had a mouthful of gold teeth that glinted in the dim light, had been preparing hot dishes and insisted we stay and eat with them. We sat on the floor, and she lined up rows of bowls in front of us. Knowing the dangers in suddenly plumping for rich food, I chose a bowl of boiled rice, which was heavily salted and peppered. I tucked in and got a nudge in the ribs from Dr. Matheson, urging me to take it easy. We ate as little as we could without offending our gracious hosts. They were extremely grateful and obviously had nowhere else to go. To my surprise, I felt no animosity whatsoever towards this family, despite what their countrymen had put me through. The young girl deserved treatment as much as anybody, and Dr. Matheson was of the same mind. As a true professional, he had even treated the Japanese officers while on the death railway. It made me feel rather good inside to have been able to help them. The woman disappeared again and returned with 2 bolts of Japanese silks, 1 for each one of us. They were gorgeously made, with extraordinarily colourful patterns, which I guessed would have been crafted into a kimono. I thought they were beautiful, and I was extremely grateful. In fact, I ensured my silk was kept safe. Years later, I would give the piece of silk to my sister Rhoda, who made it into a housecoat. A few days later, while working in the hospital, I heard a commotion outside. As I stepped out, I caught my first glimpse of US Marines. They had driven into camp on 7 or 8 lorries with white markings. For a stunned moment I gazed at them. It was so long since I had seen a white man who did not resemble a skeleton. I shouted for Dr. Matheson to come out. We stood and watched in amazement. Smiling and strapping Yanks in pressed khaki uniforms were dispensing cigarettes by the fistful, hugging rag-and-bone strangers. Men were shouting and screaming, throwing things in the air, weeping and kissing the earth, lost in emotion. Some of the Americans were visibly upset at the sight of us and the pathetic state we were in. They lifted up men's shirts, shocked by the angular and protruding rib cages, bloated bellies and infant waistlines. I shook hands with Dr. Matheson. We shared a silent moment, taking it all in, before I went back to my hut to collect what few things I still had with me. Technically, I wasn't in the medical corps, so I went back with the troops. I jumped on one of the first trucks to speed out of the camp. It ferried us to Nagasaki harbor, where a ship was waiting to escort us to freedom. The Americans no doubt had to make several journeys to pick everyone up from the camp, so I was glad to be one of the first out. The American driver was obviously off his rocker, not bothering to dodge boulders. He careered on, lifting us high from our pews and bouncing our heads off the canvas. I stared at the countryside from the rear of the lorry. While it had been relatively bare before, the hedgerows and trees now appeared to be dying. As we thundered on, the greenness of the hedgerows faded. Reddish-brown leaves turned brown, grey, and then black. Fairly soon, nothing was left. No birds sang, nothing lived. Trees had been reduced to knee-high ashen stumps. The area looked like the aftermath of a mass blanket bombing raid. Soot, ash, and dust lay piled deep like fresh snow along the verge. The truck kicked up great clouds of fine grey dust as it sped along. The Stour had us all choking and lent us a ghostly demeanour as it settled on us. The Yanks told us proudly that they had dropped a special bomb on Nagasaki, but I knew nothing of radioactivity or of the near-fatal consequences my exposure to it would have. We searched in vain for bomb craters, unaware of the atomic airburst that had flattened Nagasaki and extinguished the life of 35,000 of its residents. You could not tell it had once been a city with a pre-war population of 195,000. It looked more like the dark side of the moon. I spotted just one remaining concrete structure that looked like a building. It was difficult to comprehend. Yet it would take more than this strange sight to spoil our party. Covered in radioactive dust, the boys were laughing, crying, and singing. The words that rang out across the shattered ruins of Nagasaki were never sung with more conviction and passion. Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. But I remained detached, unsure of what to think. In fact, I was still terrified, a reflection of how traumatized I had been by years of living in the shadow of the sword. Every rock we ran over, every clang and start scared me. How safe are we? Rogue Japanese could be hiding around the corner, waiting for us. My mind suddenly turned to home. Will I really make it? Will Mother and Father still be alive? Whatever happened to Douglas? Was he killed in action? And Eric? God, I hope Hazel doesn't have a boyfriend. I was disturbed by the sight of the devastation, but felt no sympathy for the Japanese. Serves them bloody well, right, I thought. How else was it going to end? After 45 minutes or so, we arrived at Nagasaki harbor. While the quayside still showed the effects of the bomb, with blackened patches and blasted buildings, it had been somewhat patched up. A gigantic U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, the USS Cape Gloucester, stretched the entire length of the docks, blocking out the sun. I had never seen anything like it. In its vast shadow, the Americans had engineered some makeshift open-roofed showers with partitions. I was given a bar of pink soap and ushered to a space. I undressed and stood straight under the jets of bracing water. Despite the chill, it was the finest shower I had ever had, and my first proper wash in 3.5 years. I scrubbed frantically, working up the thickest lather possible, rubbing it into all my forgotten nooks and crannies. I had been filthy for so long, and the grime was so ingrained that very little dirt actually came off. But on the inside, it had extremely therapeutic powers. Ignoring the soldiers telling me to hurry up, I savoured every moment, just letting the water bounce off my head and neck. After half an hour, they practically dragged me from the showers to be fumigated and deloused before being placed on the scales. When I left Aberdeen, I had weighed a healthy 135 pounds, but here in Nagasaki, on the steelyard scales, very accurate contraptions similar to those I had used at the plumber's merchants, I was reduced to a skeletal 82 pounds. New arrivals, men from the vast industrial gulag the Japanese had created in Fukuoka, flooded the quayside and lengthened the queues for showers. Sadly, at this final hurdle, some men did not make it and died on that quay. This distressed the Americans immensely, and they were shocked by the matter-of-fact way that the other prisoners accepted the deaths of their mates. We had seen so much, too much. As I stepped into my tan boiler suit issued by the Americans, I was pleased to have arrived early. A marine band from the Cape Gloucester started playing Anchors Aweigh on the quayside. Men went bananas, bursting into song and dance, waving their arms in the air to the 2 o'clock jump. With sailors giving me a helping hand, my spindly legs struggled up the rickety gangplank to the hangar deck, where row upon row of camp beds had been arranged. There must have been hundreds of them, and I took the first space available and sat down. Streams of men poured in, some nervous and wary, others delirious with happiness, while some were just plain delirious. The chap beside me, Dennis Southgate, was from Cornwall and a survivor from HMS Prince of Wales, which had been sunk by Japanese bombers off the coast of Malaya at the outbreak of the war. We got chatting. He had also been at Fukuoka Camp 25, but we had never met. All of our spirits lifted later that first balmy night when music was played over the tannoy system. The first tune, a new one to me, was Sentimental Journey by Glenn Miller. It remains to this day my favourite song. We were allowed up on the main deck in batches. It was a terrific evening, no clouds in the sky, as another Glenn Miller song, Moonlight Serenade, blared out scratchily from the speakers. As we sailed out of Nagasaki, I looked back at the devastation the militarist rulers of Japan had brought on their country. Surveying that atomic wasteland to the big band sounds of Glenn Miller was the defining moment of my life. That night on board the USS Cape Gloucester, I slept peacefully for the first time in years. It was the only time since our capture 3.5 years earlier that I had gone to bed without the terrible sleep-depriving companion of fear. The next morning I went to the galley for breakfast. When I arrived, I thought I had taken a wrong turn while negotiating the maze of steel corridors that snaked through the innards of the massive ship. It felt like I had intruded on a wild party or stepped into a carnival. Men were whooping and hollering, clapping and singing like enraptured evangelists. The catalyst for the furore centered all too predictably around the long stainless steel canteen. Men lined up impatiently in a long disorderly queue to the serving area, where immaculately attired Americans, I still could not get over how clean and healthy they looked compared with us, were dishing out mountainous servings. A bulky Afro-American cook greeted us all with a beaming broad smile and urged us to get stuck in. "Tuck in, boys, it's all you can eat." We felt like kids in a sweet shop. I had never seen so many boiled eggs in my life, piled high in vast rows of gleaming white pyramids that made me wonder if the ship was carrying the world's entire supply. Men loaded handfuls onto their plates, adding liberal dashes of milky cereal, soft white bread, and maple syrup. The smell of the cooked food sent my head spinning, and I had to actually clamp my mouth shut to stop from drooling. The temptation was too much for most of the lads, but I recalled Dr. Mathewson's earlier advice and steered clear of the most exotic and tantalizing delights. Instead, with the greatest reluctance, I plumped for half an egg, a single slice of lightly toasted bread with a thick layer of margarine, and a cup of tea. It required immense willpower not to eat more, but once I had finished and sat for 10 minutes, I did feel full. I was telling guys around me to be careful, that their stomachs had shrunk to dangerously small proportions. The response was resoundingly and emphatically in the negative. No frugal and canny Scot was telling these starving boys to watch what they ate. After my protestations were overruled, I went searching for Dr. Matheson. I finally found him in the officers' mess. I pleaded my case to the officer on the door, and was allowed in to speak to the doctor. I told him what was happening in the galley, and in his usual considered manner he replied, "I've already spoken to the captain and explained the medical situation. Keep telling people, though." I went back to the galley, which had not calmed down. Already some men were feeling sickly, their deprived stomachs at bursting point. I kept passing the message on, but generally got told to bugger off and mind my own business. Sadly, several men fell critically ill from overindulging, not that anyone, and certainly not me, could blame them. But I felt a terrific sadness when I heard that a man had died from gorging and the subsequent damage it caused to his innards. Here we had survived 3 or 4 hellish years, undergoing some of the greatest atrocities and human sufferings of all time, and men were succumbing on the journey home. Those smiling American chefs and their huge hearts had inadvertently killed men with kindness. After that, they reduced the portions greatly and stopped the buffet altogether. I spent a lot of time on my bunk, composing in my mind a letter to my mother. It took some time and many miles before I could bring myself to put pen to paper. We soon arrived at Okinawa, site of the last pitched battle in the war just months earlier, where we transferred to a troop ship, the USS Tryon, and set sail at once for Manila in the Philippines. Once back at sea, the Army insisted that we each sign a document stating that we would refrain from speaking about our wartime experiences. I was outraged and felt uncomfortable with the notion, so I signed as George Kynoch, using my father's Christian name and my mother's maiden name. I employed the same backhand style that I had used during the Selarang incident, knowing full well they could never produce it as evidence. I felt that the British government wanted to suppress the true horrors, hide the facts, and appease the Japanese. I wanted nothing to do with a cover-up. I finally penned a long and rambling letter to my mother that I hoped to mail from Manila. I was coming home, my thoughts ran away from my pen. Trying to condense 3.5 years of hell into a bite-sized chunk that was palatable for my family proved incredibly difficult. My mother kept my letter as a treasured possession, and I have it still. Hello, folks. This is your old son, aged 26 years, coming to you by courtesy of the once Imperial Japanese Army. That's what they told you if they ever gave you anything. Well, I hope you are all well and happy, and I hope looking forward to my homecoming as eagerly as I. It has been a long, troublesome and heartbreaking period those last 6 years, but you and I have at last got a break, and well deserved, I think. There is little need to tell you, as some of the stories are already in print, that we have been treated worse than pigs, but thanks to God, I am spared. At this point, let us pause for a few moments in memory of so many of my fine pals who helped me through in those days of torture in Thailand, but who were lost at sea on the journey to Japan. We left Nagasaki on the aircraft carrier Cape Gloucester and were transferred onto the ship at Okinawa, where we are en route for Manila, where we should arrive on the 29th of September 45. The experience of the last 3.5 years has taught me many lessons and hard ones. The crowning joy will be my arrival at the station at Aberdeen. Please give my kindest regards to my relations, and if any to my friends of the pre-war years. Gee, it's going to be embarrassing trying to pick up the threads again, especially in my future job, whatever that may be. Mother, there is one person you have to thank more than anyone else in the world for my presence here now, and that is Hazel Watson. It appears that while I was lying in hospital at death's door, very ill with dysentery and beriberi, my pals had done everything they could to make me buck my spirits up and make a fight for it, but I must have been in a coma. I cannot remember much of what happened. However, they raked out my photographs, and, as Hazel was the most prominent and most likely my girlfriend, they kept repeating her name and showing me her photograph. They said it was not until 3 hours later that I seemed to recollect and began repeating her name over and over again, which was the turning point, as I gradually grew better day by day, weighing approximately 5 stone at that time. But please, Mother, keep this to ourselves, as I do not wish her to know, as it puts her and myself in an awkward position. I believe she is married, but am not sure. I have never managed to determine my feelings for Hazel, but it is sufficient that the thought of her pulled me together at the critical moment. I only wish that the fellows who looked after me then and gave me what little supplies of milk and eggs they risked their lives to steal off the Japanese guards had been spared for this day. Well, Mother, that is the terrible price of the war, and we can only hope there will never be another. Hoping this finds you as it leaves me. All the best, love to all at home, hoping to see you soon. Cheerio, your ever-loving son, Alistair Thau-Yi-6. Dennis Southgate, who preferred to be called Tiny, even though he was larger than me, asked what I was writing. I told him, but he just shrugged. You should write home too, I said. Your parents would be thrilled to hear from you." "I don't think so," the 22-year-old Marine replied, sounding defeated. "Nonsense, man! Here!" I shoved a pen and paper in his lap. I sat beside him on the camp bed. "I'll help you." Maybe camp life had broken him, or maybe he was illiterate, but words failed to come. I basically dictated a simple letter home, addressed to his mother in St. Austell in Cornwall, and he seemed to cheer up a little. The days at sea went slowly, and my mind kept returning to the haunting memories of our POW existence. Playing quoits on deck could preoccupy me for only so long. My recurring nightmare of surrender at Fort Canning continued, and the Black Prince, the Mad Mongrel, Hellfire Pass, and the sinking of the Hellship also began to haunt me. They continue to disturb me to this day. We arrived at the port of Manila on 25 September 1945. Trucks ferried us to a military hospital, which was run by Americans, but we were cared for by Filipino nurses who treated us very well. The eyes of the nurses welled up, and many were reduced to tears when they saw the state of us. Seeing so many pitiful walking skeletons and so many men robbed of their youth was too much for the nurses to bear. They were more openly disturbed by our appearance than the Americans had been, and their unconcealed emotion brought home just how malnourished and ill we were. For 2 weeks we lay confined to our hospital beds. Occasionally I would get up and walk around the ward, but it was not encouraged. The one upside for many of us was that the Filipino nurses were extremely beautiful, as well as dutiful and kind. One about my age took a particular shine to me, which cheered me up no end. She was very attractive, with flowing black hair that glistened like coal, and asked for my home address, vowing to write to me. I was wary that she wanted a Western husband, but maybe I was too harsh on her, for when I arrived home there was indeed a very sweet letter waiting, wishing me well and saying how much of a pleasure it was meeting me. We bade farewell to the lovely nurses of Manila and clambered back on board the USS Tryon. 10 days later, on 19th of October, we arrived at Honolulu, the capital of the far-flung U.S. state of Hawaii. As the ship berthed in the now rebuilt Pearl Harbor, a tannoy announced that any men who wished to could go on deck, where on the starboard side a traditional welcoming ceremony would be performed for us. I raced upstairs, bounding 2 at a time, elbowing others out of my way. This sounded too good to miss. It was a balmy evening bathed in moonlight that shimmered off the calm water in the harbour. We waited in an expectant silence that was broken by a jaunty ukulele tune that got louder and louder. As a fleet of small wooden canoes came into sight from the bow, the sky filled with glorious female voices singing strange songs that I took for indigenous classics. As the occupants of the guitar-playing and angel-voiced canoes came into the light, the men erupted into cheers and clapping. Buxom Hawaiian lassies with bright flowers around their necks and grass skirts wiggling were waving, smiling, and still performing, putting on a real show. Seeing the women perform the hula-hula dance and hearing the upbeat music brought tears to many a hardened eye. We felt like returning heroes, yet it would be the first and last time that I would have that feeling. I didn't realize it at the time, but this was the best homecoming I would receive. We stayed overnight to refuel, and I cabled home. I wrote in longhand, "Am well, hope to be home soon, safe in Hawaii, love Alistair," and gave the message to the ship's purser, who arranged for it to be wired. 6 days later, on the 26th of October, we arrived at San Francisco, sailing under the magnificent Golden Gate Bridge, completed just 8 years before in a Herculean engineering feat. Setting foot on American soil was nearly as emotional as the Hawaiian welcoming party, just without the fanfare. The sensation of being safe was more tangible. Being in a Western country where people looked and dressed the same, had much the same sensibilities, and ate the same food just felt right. It was probably an unwarranted sensation, but even so, it was how I felt. A lorry took us to another military hospital on the suburban outskirts of the hilly city. Now feeling slightly better with every day, the thought of lying in a hospital bed for another period of weeks sucked a lot of energy from me. I was becoming more and more frustrated that it was taking so long to get home. At first I had imagined that we would be taken to an airbase and flown home immediately, possibly first class after what we had endured. A British Red Cross telegram from my parents sat waiting for me at the San Francisco hospital. It read, "Cables received, all well, hope see you soon, Urquhart." Hearing from the clan, knowing they were well and that they knew I was well, was enough to encourage a long and unbroken sleep. In the morning I felt as fresh as a Yankee soldier's T-shirt, and probably better than I had felt in years. Around mid-morning, while I was following one of the orderlies on his rounds, trying to pick up some tips, the head nurse came in with a visitor. She was introduced as Miss Ash, an elderly lady who ran a rehabilitation centre nearby. The head nurse told us that Miss Ash wanted to know if any of us would like to join her for a day out of the hospital. The offer was met with virtual silence until I piped up, "I'll go." Miss Ash reminded me of my mother. She looked similar and even shared the same bun hairstyle. She was delighted that someone had taken up her offer. No doubt half of the other men would have agreed if she had been 30 years younger and blonde, but I was simply keen to get out of the hospital. I had been cooped up too long. She led me to her car, a bright blue land whale so immense I could hardly believe she was about to get behind the wheel. Before we left the hospital car park, she turned to me and asked in her highly refined American manner, "Where would you like to go?" I considered her question for a moment before realizing that I had no clue what was nearby. I didn't even have any money, not a dime. "You choose," I said. We went through the streets of San Francisco, a booming town full of sailors, soldiers, and tramcars similar to those in Aberdeen, but that went up and down steep hills later to become famous in Hollywood car chases. We bounced along in the huge Pontiac past rows of wooden two-story houses, gaily painted in pastels, and across the Bay Bridge into the spectacular Californian countryside. On that first day, Miss Ash drove for hours, taking me to see the giant redwood forests, trees that reached into the heavens, dizzying my disbelieving head. She spoke incessantly, asking all about me. She was especially keen to hear all about the POW camps, the death railway, and the hellships. Despite her tears and my sentences that tailed off like the tarmac in her rearview mirror, she ploughed on. I had no qualms at that time talking about my experiences to her and relayed them as accurately as I could. After driving around all day, Miss Ash dropped me back at the hospital shortly before dusk. I thanked her, and as I stepped out of the car, she said, "See you tomorrow. We'll go up the Big Sur. It's beautiful this time of the year." "You don't have to, Miss Ash. I've had a lovely day and you must be awfully busy." "Nonsense," she said. "I'll pick you up after breakfast." And so began a most enjoyable stay. Miss Ash and I drove all over California. The Golden State stretches for 160,000 square miles, over 5 times the size of Scotland. She took me to parties with her friends, at which I met several expatriates from Scotland. We went on long drives along the coast and enjoyed picnics in the woods. It was one of the most pleasant experiences I had ever had. She even took me to Los Angeles, paying for us to stay at a hotel just off Hollywood Boulevard. We took in the Walk of Fame, the Chinese Theatre, Venice Beach, and everything in between. Miss Ash knew I had no money, and she paid for everything without ever making a fuss. She was a lifelong spinster, and I became something of a son to her. It was the start of a close friendship that lasted for many years, and involved her coming to visit me and my family back in Scotland, and a huge hamper sent across the Atlantic every Christmas. Every night when I returned to the hospital, the boys would be waiting to ask where I had been that day. I relished filling them in great detail. They were hugely envious. I always came back bearing stacks of fruit, cake, and sweets for general distribution that eased their envy somewhat. I just thanked my lucky stars that I had volunteered that day to go with this remarkable, kind, and charismatic woman. One evening, Miss Ash invited me to a Halloween party at the convalescent home where she lived. In a grand mansion tucked away in acres of bushy shrubs, cultivated lawns, paved areas, and waterfalls, Miss Ash gave me the honour of wheeling in a 99-year-old lady in a wheelchair for dinner, after ducking for apples and feeding the baby with the sick and recovering children. I met a lovely girl who was about 21, paralysed and in a wheelchair. I took an interest, wheeling her about, trying to help her, and make her evening a memorable one. Miss Ash commented that the girl's eyes followed me around the room. At least it appeared that I had made somebody at the party as happy as I was. Sadly, the time came for us to leave San Francisco and my newfound but short-lived life. On 2nd November 1945, we were taken to the train station, where first-class Pullmans and dining cars awaited us, and a 6-day journey to New York, spanning the 3,000-mile girth of America. Miss Ash, thoughtful and generous as ever, showed up at the station with a large hamper brimming with goodies, including fruit, chocolate, and cigarettes for the lads. Another tearful farewell, and I waved goodbye to Miss Ash and went to find my seat. Before I sat down, I noticed that an elderly couple was without a seat, and I nudged a fellow Scot already sitting and staring out the window. Seeing the couple, he got up without thinking, and I ushered them over, offering our seats. To our great surprise, they were extremely grateful for our generosity, exclaiming that they had never heard of such gentlemanly courtesy. Before long, the whole cabin heard of our remarkable good manners, and we swelled with pride. At least some of our pride in our country and where we came from was still there. The trip, although long, was not one I would have missed. The ushers treated us like royalty, pulling down our beds in the evening and waiting on us hand and foot. I spent most of the journey sipping tea and staring out of the window. The countryside changed so much, from the fertile coastal lands through to cactus-clad deserts, where I saw my first ever proper cowboys just like the ones from the silver screen, grizzly gents on horseback wearing Stetsons and spurs. Arriving at Chicago train station was something spectacular, even though we never got off and sat there for 3 hours. Just taking in the sublime architecture of the station and its bustling inhabitants was enough for us former POWs, who had suffered from sensory deprivation for so long. Despite being at liberty, we still needed telling what to do. None of us had money for food, beds, or activities, so when we got to New York City on 7th of November, we were still at the mercy of Army logistics. They put us into another hospital, but this time allowed us out and about, with Army guides to show us the sights. Being a freshly liberated POW did, as it happened, have some benefits. When we arrived at the base of the mighty Empire State Building at the intersection of 5th Avenue and West 34th Street, we found ourselves ushered to the front of the snaking queue. With several elevators freed exclusively for our use, the rest of the building was cleared. We had the run of what was then the tallest building on the planet. Once at the top, we giggled like schoolgirls as we clambered to the side to take in the scenery. Yellow taxis crawled like maggots down below, and the rush-hour foot traffic appeared no more than a fumbling army of dots. Sadly, it was rather smoggy, and our vista was clouded out, but we could still see as far as the Hudson River, the Statue of Liberty, and Central Park, as well as take in the fresh air of freedom. The next day, we went to see the world-famous Norwegian ice skater Sonja Henie perform her show. As a keen dancer, I was staggered by her speed, grace, and showmanship, and clapped rapturously until my bony hands hurt. We had no time for shopping, and still didn't possess a dime between us, but New York was a wonderful city to wander around. Inhaling its colourful mix of creeds, cultures, and commerce temporarily relegated the horrors of the last few years to the back of my mind. The respite was brief. After 5 pleasant days, we were ready to sail back to the United Kingdom on 12th of November aboard the Queen Mary, once a luxury liner but now converted into a less than luxurious troopship. It had once carried British Prime Minister Winston Churchill across the Atlantic for crucial talks with Allied officials. When we boarded at New York, it was crammed with hundreds, if not thousands, of other soldiers, all gleefully bound on the last leg across the Atlantic for home. 5 days at sea, sleeping on the floor of a former lounge and unable to move about because of the sheer volume of passengers, made me glad to enter Southampton Harbour. We had been well looked after, with exceptional care taken to provide us with the best food, but I was probably one of the poorest eaters on board. I still couldn't face eating anything substantial and stuck to bowls of cold custard or soup. Watching others gorge themselves made me nauseous. I had been counting the hours. The thought of arriving home was mind-boggling to me. It felt like visiting a strange land for the first time, one I had only read about in books. It was like when you go on holiday to somewhere new, and you know it won't resemble the picture you've built up in your mind. But that is all you have to go with, so you succumb to it. That is how I felt, and I tried to limit my expectations and shun thoughts of what I would do once I got back to Aberdeen. I banished thoughts of gaining new employment and readjusting to society. Despite my low expectations, nothing could have prepared me for the disappointment of arriving in dismal Southampton. No quayside band, no media or fanfare awaited us, and most importantly, no family. I had fully expected to see Mum and Dad, Auntie Dossie, maybe even Bill and Rhoda, but there was nobody, just a handful of industrious dock workers. All of the men felt devastated, as if a light had been snuffed out in our souls. Feelings of disappointment, irritation, and dread of travelling to the north of Scotland by train outweighed any anger on my behalf. That would come later, though, when I fully realised how disgracefully the British government was treating its returning heroes. Despite dying in our thousands and sacrificing honest, hard-working and ordinary lives for the greater good, liberty and justice, we found they shunned us, forgot about us, and brushed us under the political carpet. I was sure that my 3-month journey home by the most circuitous route had been a deliberate political ploy by the government. I felt that they wanted us to recuperate on the way home to shield the British public from the state we were in and allow for the development of future good trading relations with Japan. I sent a cable home from Southampton rail station saying, "Home tomorrow," and obtained a rail warrant. I caught a commuter train to London, where I hopped off at Victoria Station. Disoriented and bewildered, I bungled my way across London asking strangers for directions to King's Cross, where my last train awaited. At King's Cross Station, a couple of military police officers accosted me. "Are you going to Aberdeen, lad?" one of them asked in a Cockney accent. He must have heard me asking for my ticket. "Yes, why?" "Come with me." Wondering what I had done wrong this time, I followed him to an office. A ghostly-looking chap sat on a chair rocking back and forth in front of a paper-strewn desk. He looked up at me and said bleakly, "They're out to get me." I looked at the red caps, who shrugged. Not caring that the poor chap could hear them, they told me he was away with the fairies. He had been a regular in the Gordons and had been captured in Singapore. He was a complete wreck and had obviously suffered horrendously at the hands of the Japanese, but all they could elicit from him was that his name was Hugh and he was from Inveruria in Aberdeenshire. Despite the fact that he was extremely depressed and mentally ill, they put me in charge of him for the journey home, with strict instructions not to let him out of sight and to hand him over to some red caps at Aberdeen Station. I reluctantly agreed, thinking that it would at least keep my mind off other things. We got a second-class seat and I plonked him by the window, hoping the passing countryside would placate him. He had a wild look in his eyes and jabbered nonsense constantly. I had the feeling that he could become aggressive at any time, so I treated him good-naturedly and tried to calm him with soothing words. The journey was a nightmare. Hugh was a handful, and I spent most of my time apologizing to others for his loud outbursts, which were frequent and disturbing. Seeing him in that state really got to me. I prayed that I wouldn't descend back down the same dark path. I tried to convince him that he was back in Britain and would be safe now. Nobody was coming to get him. As we pulled into Aberdeen Joint Station at 6 a.m. on the 18th of November 1945, I told him to look out the window, hoping he would recognise the view as we crossed the River Dee. I left him with the red caps in much the same state as when I first met him, bidding him farewell and wishing him luck, though I'm not sure he heard. Once I knew Hugh was safely in their hands, I ventured to the main entrance, where I knew the family would be waiting. I spotted Mum first. Her distinctive hair and height gave her away. I walked up to Mum, Dad, Dossie, Rhoda, and a young chap I didn't recognise. I hugged Mum, and I shall never forget the look in her eyes. She was so shocked and upset, probably by my skin and bone appearance and lack of hair. I hugged Dossie, Dad, and Rhoda, and the tears could no longer be held back. Both my mother and father had aged far beyond their years. My ordeal had taken a toll on them as well as myself. I turned to the young chap and said, "Are you Rhoda's boyfriend?" Eyebrows raised, he said, "No, you bloody fool! I am your brother Bill!" It just went to show what 6 years of war could do to him and me. Also, there was Doug's new wife, Cicely, from Oxfordshire, and she introduced me to their new baby boy born just a few months before. They had named him Alistair in my honour. Then it emerged that they had all thought I had been killed. None of the half-dozen cards or so that I had sent from the camps had ever arrived in Aberdeen. I was back from the dead. On the tram journey home to Seafield Drive, I asked where Douglas was. I was told he was abroad, working for the Foreign Office, but nobody had heard from him in months. He had been in the Army's glider regiment and had broken both of his ankles during a mission into occupied France. He reinvented himself as a war correspondent in the Middle East. Before the war, he could speak French and German from his school days and had subsequently learned 4 more languages. The Foreign Office had signed him up for his skills. I wouldn't see him again until the following Christmas, when he returned as a shattered wreck, barely alive, looking as if he himself had been a POW and confined to the Black Hole for several months. He had disappeared on some cloak and dagger mission, abandoning his new wife and baby boy for more than a year. On his bizarre return, he refused to tell anybody where he had been and was very nearly a broken man. By the time we reached home, I was already feeling panicky. Everyone had so many questions. Sometimes it felt as if they were all asking at once. This was not how I had thought I would feel on my homecoming. So much had changed. Mum had prepared a lavish breakfast for my return, and the table was laid out when we got back home shortly after 7 a.m. We sat down for a family meal with everyone on their best behaviour. Even father was keen to dote on me. Mum served up tatty scones, sausages, eggs, the real works. Despite much encouragement and insistence, I could only pick at my food. I asked about Hazel, and without looking at me, Mum said she had married during the war and moved to Canada. I was not upset. In fact, I was glad that she had moved on and seemed happy. Then Mum cleared her throat and told me nervously, "You should also know, Alistair, that your friend Eric didn't make it." I felt ill. I could barely lift my head, and the conversation buzzed around me. The words became jumbled, and I could no longer make them out, as the kitchen walls seemed to close in. It was like a bout of cholera, the claustrophobia enhanced by the cramped kitchen and the desperate shows of love and affection my poor family poured on me. "He was killed on his first mission over Europe," Dad said. "He was a rear gunner, a real brave soul." It was all too much, yet another kick in the face. Even though I had been around so much death and had lived it and breathed it, nothing prepared me for the loss of such a close friend. All I could think was, why then am I still alive? By what miracle had I returned home? Suddenly I snapped. I slammed my fork down on Mum's finest crockery plate and stood up, the chair screeching on the wooden floor. The room fell silent. It was so unlike me to make a scene. It was completely out of character. I knew they were trying to help, but I just couldn't stand it. "I'm going out," I announced. I was already half out the door when a chorus of "I'll come with you" and "Come back, Alistair" rang out. But I was off. I needed to be alone. My head felt like it was going to pop, and fresh air seemed the only answer. I walked and walked. Past the Co-op and up Auchignel Bray, I hardly broke stride. Before long, I was miles from home, walking with purpose, but without forethought or direction. Aberdeen could not possibly have physically changed much during the war years, but somehow I failed to recognise any of the surroundings. It all felt surreal, and nothing seemed familiar. God knows where I walked, but I kept on going, strolling without respite. Even when it got dark, I kept on going and going, step after step, on my own enforced route march. I did not return home until around 5 o'clock the next morning. My parents were still up, obviously worried sick. As I crawled up the stairs to find a bed to lie down in, utterly exhausted, they asked where I had been. "We've been out looking for you," Mum pleaded, begging for information. "And all night," Dad chimed in. "We even called the police. What have you to say for yourself, son? It's freezing outside." I hated myself. I knew they were trying to be there for me, but I just wanted to be on my own. I had lived a solitary and sorry life for so long that love only suffocated me. In many respects, my family felt like strangers. How does one describe the feelings of a person who has been through something like we had, something no one could ever have envisaged? They could never comprehend the depths of man's inhumanity to man, or the awfulness of an existence that consisted of surviving one day at a time. I flopped down on my old bed in the room that I had helped build with my father all those years ago, and slept all day and the next night. The recurring nightmares of the railway came again, leaving me afraid to lie down. When I went downstairs the next day, I ate a quick and light breakfast before promptly disappearing again. For the next few months, my daily routine consisted of long and pointless walks. After a while, I started looking at people's faces, trying to spot anybody I knew from before the war, but I never did, not in the whole town. But I did purposely avoid my old haunts, especially the plumbers' merchants, Duthie Park, and the dance halls. I created mayhem at home, where I was morose, rude, and short on patience. My sister Rhoda, God bless her, was so supportive and in many ways eased the situation, although I cannot ever remember thanking her, such was the state of my mind. I was irrational and unable to control my actions. I wanted only to be on my own, outside the four walls, wandering aimlessly in and around the streets of Aberdeen. After a few weeks pounding the strange streets of my hometown, my body began to fall apart. I started to suffer with pains from beriberi, which attacked my legs, back and arms, and the cold winter air did not help. When my bowels started playing up as well, I decided it was time to visit my local GP, Dr. Rice. I told him that I had amoebic dysentery while incarcerated, so he put me on a course of intramuscular injections. He injected my left arm, but the skin began to tighten and swell and became incredibly painful, so he went for the other, which did the same thing. After that, I couldn't lie on my back or sides, couldn't bear sheets or clothing to touch them. Life was pretty bad, despite the relative luxury I was afforded. I still could not eat properly. I left untouched all of my old favourites, which Mum loved preparing for me. Much to my surprise, I craved rice, the lousy stuff that we had all hated so much. The aptly named Dr. Rice arranged for me to attend Stracathro Hospital, a large country house near Brechin in the neighbouring county of Angus that had been converted into a military hospital. They did all of their tests and suggested different foods, but I was still unable to take anything except fluids. My health suffered accordingly, and I became weaker by the day. I stayed there for several weeks. I could go home at the weekends, but I had little money and nobody in the family had a car, so it was not an option. Mum and Dossie started out one Saturday but got on the wrong bus and never arrived at the hospital. One day, a baffled doctor visited my bedside and said he couldn't understand why I couldn't take food. I told him, "If you had to survive on nothing else but rice and water for 3.5 years, then maybe you could understand." "Yes, perhaps you are right. We just don't know what else to do for you," he said rather ashamedly. "Maybe my body is craving rice," I suggested in a less defensive tone. "We could try it." It seemed logical, and perhaps not surprisingly, it worked. My body responded to the rice and seemed to relax. My throat opened up, and my bowels went from a stormy sea to a mill pond. I ate rice pudding every day for several weeks, and relished it too. After a while I was put onto tripe, which did me the world of good, and then onto some white fish. After 3 months and a final prognosis of having suffered from a duodenal ulcer, I came out of hospital armed with instructions for my mum on how to cook tripe, which she despised. She cooked fish, poached in milk, and servings of rice, as exotic as it got in those days. To this day, I still have to eat rice 2 or 3 times a week, with some fish or chicken. Anything else causes havoc with my insides. One of my favourite dishes in Singapore had been a curry, but never again. Even an onion is enough to set me off, The diet courtesy of the Emperor's Imperial Army, along with years of dysentery, had destroyed the linings in my stomach and done irreparable damage. Thanks to my new diet and more rest and recuperation at home, where I hardly had to lift a finger, my body, mind and soul began to recover. I wrote to the Royal Army Pay Corps headquarters, gave them my rank and number, and asked for payments because I was still unfit for work. They tallied up my pay for my time as a POW, and after deductions for subsistence, I received the grand sum of £434 for the period from the 15th of February 1942 to the 18th of November 1945. The charge for subsistence infuriated me. They were making us pay for those handfuls of maggoty rice, yet it was standard practice and applied to all returning prisoners. It is a miracle that they did not charge me for the loss of my rifle, as they did some men. Early in 1946, and still a de facto member of the British Army, I was summoned to appear in front of a medical board at Woodend Hospital, Aberdeen. The board comprised 4 well-fed and comfortable-looking officers sitting behind a desk. They told me that the conditions of my military discharge hinged on my producing my army records, and that unless I could produce records of all the diseases that beset me in the POW camps, they were not able to consider my situation. I was stunned. I sat in an awkward silence, trying to compose my thoughts and control my rage before speaking. "Sirs," I said, "have you any conception of conditions in the Japanese prison camps?" They did not reply, so I went on. There were no pencils, pens, paper, no toilet paper, drugs, toiletries, soap or water to wash. Never mind keeping records of each POW in many, many camps, certainly not in Kanyu or the Hellfire Pass camps. Just how much recording the Japanese kept is very little, as my Japanese record card shows. The chairman broke the silence that followed, saying, "Then we are sorry, we are unable to help." This, then, was the sort of treatment meted out by the army. It took another 3 or 4 meetings with various medical boards before they offered me demobilization, but only if I agreed to pass myself as A1, which foolishly I did. I was so fed up of being downtrodden by the army, but I had let them off the hook of having to pay me any kind of disability war pension. It was a dirty trick played on many of the returning Far Eastern prisoners of war. 2 days later, I went on my way down south for an official discharge, and was issued with a brown-checked demobbing suit and hat, the usual army fitting, and a pair of shoes. Hurrah, free of the army at last. By February 1946, I thought it was time to take a chance and try dancing again. I dusted off an old pair of dancing shoes with leather soles. My good pair had been abandoned back in Singapore, and shined them up. As I nuggeted them and buffed up a reasonable shine, I was surprised at how unsteady my hands were. I was nervous. While dancing had always come very easily and naturally to me, it felt like starting afresh. It had been so long since I had allowed myself any luxurious thoughts of quick steps or the tidal rise and fall of the waltz. But above all else, returning to social circles, dealing and talking with strangers, horrified me. I decided to go to the Palais de Danse, the classier of the halls, on a quiet Wednesday night. I wore my uniform, which fitted only where it touched my still skeletal frame, and was pleased to see a lot of military people milling around outside. I recognized no faces, however. Inside, the band started up, and men at once crossed the floor, seemingly as fraught with danger as no man's land or the mine-ridden seas of the Indian Ocean, and asked women to dance. I stood there for a long time, probably an hour, before I approached a girl. I had noticed she could dance and looked assured yet kind. I tipped her dance partner, the polite way of cutting in, and got the chance for a quick-step double novelty dance. The first thing she said to me was, "So you can dance? Why did you stand for so long?" I smiled and swung her around, delighted to be back in the saddle, so to speak. I only got halfway around the floor when I was tipped by a woman who could also dance. Before I knew it, I was back in my element. I tried to remember the female faces so I could get another dance with them later. At the end of the night, on my way out, with the smile still plastered on my face, one of the women collared me to say, "I hope you come back, as I enjoyed dancing with you." That broke the ice. and I went back 2 days later for the big Friday night dance. My legs were still aching from all of the unexpected exercise, using different muscles and muscles that still needed to be built up, but nothing would stop me now. Early in the evening, I met a woman called Mary Milne, who was wearing a Women's Auxiliary Air Force uniform. She was a local lassie, 3 years younger than me, and a very good dancer. I had seen her earlier, and she had caught my eye, so I made sure I tipped in later on, and we got on well immediately. "Will you be going to the dance tomorrow?" she asked, as we tapped out a slow foxtrot. "Most certainly," I said, hardly able to control my delight. Dancing was the best rehabilitation I could have asked for, and it was also crucial to my reintegration into society. I slowly came out of my shell, thanks in no small part to Mary. She didn't ask me any questions, and I liked it that way. I told her I had been a prisoner of the Japanese, but that was as much detail as I gave. It turned out that in previous years she had courted someone who had been a prisoner of the Germans, so she sure could pick 'em. Before long, we were walking out and seeing each other as much as possible. One of our favourite things was a stroll along the beach. On one such occasion, memorable for its cloudless sky, I took an attack of malaria. It came on quickly, forcing me to sit on a bench and sending me into hot, sweaty shivers. Mary was terrified as she did not know what was happening, and when I went into a tense rigour, she helped me to a taxi and we rushed home. Dr. Rice came with his quinine and gave me a dose in bed, which sorted me out. But it took me a fortnight to recover because of an enlarged spleen. I considered it a minor setback and got back to the dancing straight away, though by now struggling to breathe through my nose properly. It had been broken so often during all of those beatings on the railway. I went in for an operation to have a hole bored through my nose bone, and while I was in, I took another malaria attack, which laid me out again, this time for a month. As a couple, Mary and I soon made friends at the various dance places. One of Mary's best friends and her boyfriend often joined us to make up a foursome. I enjoyed getting out, but I must have been awkward and possibly miserable company. In reality, I had little or no conversation. I did not wish to talk about my 6.5 years in the Far East, especially as the others had not been abroad or on active service. If someone asked about my time in the war, I regurgitated my stock answer of, "It was so bad that I don't want to talk about it." If the war came up in conversation, I would keep quiet or steer the topic elsewhere. At the outbreak of the war, Mary and her pal had gone to Glasgow to enlist and got caught in the Blitz on Clydeside. They had been in the thick of it, and while physically unharmed, they were mentally shaken. We just wanted to move on from the war. Still painfully thin and very unfit, I was unable to keep up with my newfound friends, especially in the dance halls, which put me at a disadvantage as Mary was pursued by several rivals. One particularly keen would-be suitor, who had been in a reserved occupation in Aberdeen and had never suffered during the war, really annoyed me. I became defensive and jealous. I suppose that being very self-conscious about my frail appearance and the fact that I was not earning did not help either. However, Mary and I still went out together. Perhaps she sensed there was an ember smouldering within, and at some stage it would turn to flame. I really do not know. I felt happy in her company, because only then did I find some peace of mind. No one other than one of us POWs could imagine the turmoil of the recurring nightmares that so many of us suffered. It seemed that every time I shut my eyes, I was back in the camps. It all came back to life so vividly that my body would suddenly pour with sweat and fear. I was always glad when the morning light came. During that period, I was very pleased to hear of justice being meted out to some of the worst Japanese war criminals. The Japanese press lionized General Yamashita as the Tiger of Malaya, but he should have been known as the Butcher of Malaya. He was hanged after a lengthy trial. Major General Shinpei Fukuye, the architect of the Selarang incident, went on trial and was subsequently taken to the same spot where he had brutally executed the 4 escaped prisoners and shot. Disgracefully, General Takuma Nishimura, who had ordered the massacre of the Australian wounded at Parit Sulong, received only 10 years imprisonment from the British. Later, he would be arrested by the Australians in Hong Kong as he travelled home after completing his sentence. He was subsequently tried by an Australian military court and hanged. As the trials went on, it became obvious just how much bunkum all of the Bushido code had been. The so-called way of the warrior precluded capture, yet so many of these ringleaders had been captured. The shame that to them had made us so despicable now seemed bearable and certainly preferable to the ordained harakiri. Happily, among the 256 Japanese war criminals to be executed were a loathsome duo from the death railway. The Black Prince had failed to fall on his samurai sword and revealed himself to be the coward that most swaggering bullies are. He was hanged, as was the mad mongrel. Inexplicably, Dr. Death received only 10 years. One day in July 1946, there came a knock at the door, and Dossie shouted onto me to get up and come down as I had visitors. I came downstairs, opened the door, and almost fell over. Freddie Brind stood there, with his trademark grin and his ever-present buddy, Brother Jim. It was just great to see them. I hadn't heard of them since leaving Chong Kai on the other side of the world. Until they had turned up, I didn't even know if they had made it. We shook hands and embraced. In the finest British tradition, I asked them in for a cup of tea. As Jim stayed silent, Freddie recounted their story. After their father had been taken prisoner by the Japanese and taken to Changi at around the same time as us, they hadn't seen him. He was kept in the prison where he had previously been a warden. Freddie remained stoutly calm as he said that his father died there in that jail. He had never spoken about the man much. His mother, who had escaped, was obviously much closer to the brothers. I refilled the teapot, and Freddie continued updating me in great detail. He was now working as a plumber's mate. Jim had a job at the Cello Film Factory in Brentwood, which he would work at all his days. After a while, Freddie got around to why they were in Aberdeen. They had arrived for a reunion of the Gordon Highlanders. Once he raised that topic, he wanted to talk only about the prison camps. No matter how I tried to divert the subject, he would always bring it back, recalling his comical moments, the characters and the scams, but also the horrors and the unspeakable. It was as if he were trying to make sense of it. I got the impression that he was also struggling to readjust to civilian or British life. In the camps, we all knew him as a man, or boy, really, who could acquire things, get things done. But back in Blighty, he was just another veteran despite being still in his teens. In his own eyes, he wasn't special anymore. I invited them to stay with the family while they were in Aberdeen, but they insisted that they would not impose and had booked digs in Crown Street. The next day, I went with them to the reunion at the Station Hotel in Aberdeen. It was an emotional affair, but one that indeed was necessary. I relaxed finally in the company of others who had suffered as much as I had. They knew my pain. They didn't ask awkward questions or stare at me as if I were a leper. For the rest of his life, Freddie would phone me every night, no matter what was happening in either of our lives. He just wanted to talk, always about the camps, which had left a fatal impression on him. He had to be checked into Roehampton Hospital several times, for a month or more at a time, and had even been granted a 24-hour telephone line to a psychologist. Yet he preferred to phone me and chew my ear for an hour every night, sometimes 2 hours at a time. He got married to an Essex girl, Nora, whom he met through his church. But Freddie never came out of the camps, and he drank heavily to forget. Given his experience and his character, it should not have been a shock that he became an alcoholic. Despite the love he received from his wife, his family, and me and my family, he would die within 10 years of returning to the UK of cirrhosis of the liver, still a young man. The reunion had been a cathartic experience for me, and by August 1946 I felt fitter both mentally and physically. My thoughts returned to work. I could still hear Mr. Grassi in his inimitable tone saying he would always have a job for me, one of his boys. But I knew that I would never manage the physical job I had done before the war. I paid him a visit anyway. At Lawson Turnbull and Company Limited's reception desk, a stranger was on duty. I asked to see Mr. Grassi, and she lifted the phone and dialed his room. Within seconds, the old Great War veteran appeared from his office off the main reception area. He ushered me inside and closed the door behind us. I stood, waiting to be seated in front of his large desk that commanded the immaculately tidy room. Before he sat, he eyed me up and down, taken aback by my appearance. Mr. Grassy wasn't one to show his feelings at all, but I swear that in that instant, for just a fleeting moment, he shed a tear. "It's grand to see you," he choked. "None of us thought we would ever see you again." He called for tea and biscuits to be sent in, as if trying to divert attention from his emotions. I explained to Mr. Grassy that I needed to start work again, although my health was not good, which of course he could see for himself. "You can start back whenever you feel able, Alistair. We'll find a job for you." Mr. Grassy never asked about the war. I reported for work in early September 1946, and Mr. Grassy assigned me to the office section, where I got a job estimating, controlling contracts, and customer services. I was back at work, but life could never get back to normal. My experiences at the hands of the Japanese continued to haunt me both physically and mentally, as they still do all of these years later. Even after I married, life could be hell. To this day, I suffer pain, and the nightmares can be so bad that I fight sleep for fear of the dreams that come with it. Yet I owed it to myself and to the others who never made it back to make the most of my life. I threw myself into a career and worked my way up to become managing director of another plumbing supplies business, making health and safety a priority for the staff, after what I had witnessed on the death railway. I enjoyed the work. My 2 children grew, and I took great pleasure from their success, as I did when my grandchildren came along, and when they went to university. Life continued to throw up challenges. After my wife Mary suffered a stroke, losing the power of speech, I nursed her for 12.5 years, during which she was wheelchair-bound. I think that the experiences I had on the railway and the inspirational example of our medics helped me to cope during that difficult period. At the age of 75, after Mary's death, I briefly emigrated to Canada to be close to my daughter, yet I found myself lonely and isolated in a strange country. I decided to return to Scotland. Through all of this, my sufferings as a prisoner taught me to be resilient, to appreciate life and all it has to offer. Back in Scotland, I quickly made new friends in the world of my lifelong passion, ballroom dancing, and at 90 years of age, I am still working on my slow foxtrot. I dance an average of 5 times a week and organise 2 weekly tea dances. I campaign for the residents of my sheltered housing complex and have managed to persuade the council to give us funds for computer, painting and Tai Chi classes to keep us active. I am pleased to say that the council also came off worse in my battle to have our grass and hedges cut. In recent years, my charity fundraising activities for the complex have raised hundreds of pounds to fund our activities. I am a proud member of the Far East Prisoner of War Association, POW, and regularly answer the queries of families anxious to know how their grandfathers and fathers were treated. On behalf of POW, I am very pleased to speak to schoolchildren about our experiences. My life has been long, rich and rewarding. But always, always, the ghosts of the River Kwai have remained with me. The cruel faces of the Black Prince, Dr. Death, and the Mad Mongrel have stalked my dreams for more than 6 decades now. And in my thoughts and prayers, I will never forget the faces of all those young men who died looking like old men, those prisoners who endured terrible deaths in a distant land.